Yeah, it's going to you want to? Okay, so the screening should be available for everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this workshop in what I hope it will be more an interactive session. I will use, of course, my research to draw the discussion from particularly on the use of art-based methodologies in social sciences, focusing particularly on participatory photography and video making. My research is on Israel-Palestine and on spatial violence. So many of the things I'm going to mention perhaps will resonate with some of the current affairs, which I'm sure all of us are surrounded by, which is pretty interesting because the main idea of this project and on the use of visual methods was on amplifying these representations, but of course over the years some of the issue at stakes have changed pretty much. So in other words, now we all consume the sort of things we're going to discuss today on daily basis, and the issue is that why still things haven't changed in terms of addressing social justice altogether, which I hope is so something that we can discuss together. Just to give a brief overview of my research altogether, the main aim is to look at Israel as a settler colonial country, meaning a country in which for a long time Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, Druze, and Arab communities have lived together, but something started to change where mostly in the aftermath of the Holocaust in Europe, several European white settlers started to establish there. So the issue at stake is what has changed in terms of racialization processes, in terms of power relations that eventually contributed to create the situation that we witness now. I look at this particularly in the convergence with capitalism and racial capitalism in particular, and I'm saying this because the role of colonialism should still be considered as central in the processes of extraction and expansion of the frontier. Particularly, I'm using the location of the infrastructure to inquire all these things. Infrastructure as not something that is just material, that is just about bringing things or moving things around, but really as a site from which we can also sense through our bodies all these processes. What I try to argue here is that this continuous expansion towards new frontiers, through a new scales, through new spaces outside, it's really a matter of how capitalism and colonialism ultimately function, which is and has always been about the occupation, but also the commodification of indigenous land. In other words, turning this concept of land as landedness, as a relationship not only between human beings and the land, but also between each other, with all the related political ecologies around it, into a flat representation as something that could be materially divided into individual plots and assigning, of course, property rights to it. The general questions that move my investigation is how settler infrastructure is meant to function. And I'm looking here at whole the colonial cartographic endeavors, but also archival material to really look at the intention of how and why infrastructure is ultimately planned. Secondly, I look through ethnography at how infrastructure works in practice. And then eventually I also inquire what the future trajectories of infrastructure might be, considering that indeed there is a discrepancy between these initial aims and how infrastructure function in practice. Um, as I announced, I will use the settler colonial frameworks to do so, but I will do so through some note of cautions. In fact, as I'm not sure whether at least some of you are familiar with this general paradigm, there is a general criticism to it in the sense that it's mostly developed by Western scholars in Western universities. It does not really take into account the scholarships of feminist, indigenous scholars, which perhaps not using particularly this vocabulary, but were inquiring the very same issues in the early days of the State of Israel. And therefore, I use this change of zooming in and out in looking at settler colonialism, but through the eyes, through the experiences, and through the paradigms set up by indigenous Black scholars in geography, particularly Palestinian ones. But also, as a geographer, I don't look at indigeneity as somehow a only situated and unchanging terms. I think today we hear a lot about indigenous characterization, particularly with the mushrooming of right-wing white supremacist endeavors around Europe and well beyond. So I want to clarify that indigeneity does not only mean possession or being in the land since very long time. And again, this is a political term which really defines not only the relationship between people, such as people with each other and with the land, but also and particularly through the processes of racialization faced through years of settler colonialism now. So in this way, I also combine indigenous studies with this mobility paradigm to, again, mobilize indigeneity in this more political sense. And of course, the main methodology and framework I'm going to use is from a decolonial indigenous feminist point of view. In talking about who are those who will and are hopefully also benefiting from this research is mostly Palestinian communities who greatly contributed to the project itself, but also the collective which ultimately made this project possible, such as the Wadi Ara Committee against demolition and for the right of housing in Palestine, but also an organization that is deeply involved in advocating for Palestinian special rights in Israel, such as the Arab Center for Alternative Planning, and eventually thanks also to their extensive networks with policymakers and international organizations. This project is increasingly bringing translators also on a local level into several forms of political actions that I will be discussing in a second. So I'm sure that especially in the last 2 years, this map, it's kind of becoming familiar, but it's still contested. Of course, we know that today, this region in dark gray and black has been either reclaimed as Israel or Palestine, depending, of course, on where you sit in the matrix of power. Although, as we said in the beginning of this session, cartography has also been the very endeavors through which imperial and colonial operations were enabled. I think it's important to start from indigenous cartography. And therefore naming in this sense is very important to situate ourselves in where we sit in this very matrix of power. So just to clarify some of these terms, in the top right there, you will see what is supposed to be the Golan Heights, but is actually a territory that Israel has occupied from Syria since the Six-Day War. Then we have two territories which usually are associated with spectacular forms of violence as we come to know them today, particularly the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, known as the occupied 67 territories. Now, just a bit of a background, since we are doing that, it is also important to give a platforms of, the stories that don't really make the news. Usually, the territory of the Gaza Strip in itself could be considered as a huge refugee camp, considering that Palestinians from this zone, mostly what today is known as Tel Aviv, have fled here in 1948 because of the so-called Nakba, such as the catastrophe, which saw 700,000 Palestinians fleeing their homes and over 900 villages destroyed for the establishment for what Israel has considered a legitimate state since 1948 through the War of Independence. But what is left out of this history, which I don't think is really well known, and that's why I really want to focus on this, is the histories of Palestinians living with what is known as Israel's today. These territories are often named as 48 Palestinian territories, to sort of recenter the importance of the 1948 Nakba for indeed the ethnic cleansing of indigenous communities there. So naming this territory as 48 Palestine is really about bringing to the fore the cartography and the experiences of several Palestinians who have been entrapped in the state of Israel for decades now, but also to problematize this idea of peaceful coexistence and living all under one state, which, by the way, is already occurring. But of course, we see that what the main processes are, it's about really asymmetries of powers and processes of racialization. So with this in mind, I will focus more on what I mean by deploying a feminist, decolonial, indigenous framework to the study of geography and spatiality. So first thing first, starting from this idea of the ethics of care, as a non-Palestinian, I decided to situate myself in a grounded and embodied research that is mostly moved by accountability practices, relationality, and reciprocity. In other words, instead of just filling papers about research ethics and submitting them to the usual committee and stuff like that, drawing on indigenous feminisms, I used to develop what is indeed an ethical research practice. So instead of just avoiding harm, the purpose is basically to create a positive, radical, transformative impacts. Obviously, in order to do that, the research process cannot be considered just something that occurs through ethnographic encounters. In other words, has been limited to interviews or to one-to-one time with participants. The research process is something that occurs already way before we go in the fieldwork, that continues through the fieldwork, but also continues after that. In other words, it's about the frameworks we use, the experiences that we decide to amplify, but also issues of authorships eventually and on representation that should be taken into account. So in order to do that, as I was saying, I decided to collaborate with Palestinian organizations who are already operating in the ground to basically let them decide really what my research is about. In so doing, I created a research that the participant defined as being relevant to their struggle and demands, with some practical outcomes that they could eventually present to local committees, that they could present to national plans, and they could be used to reject evictions, for instance. In other words, the purpose of research should not really be about conflating field of studies alone, but should really be moved by a radical transformative change. And this is what I believe research is ultimately about. So again, why focusing on the 48 Palestinian areas is because when compared to the regime of mobility faced by Palestinians in areas like the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, it might seem that Palestinian citizens of Israel or 48 Palestinians might somehow enjoy some more human rights or mobility rights. This is really because spatial regimes are developed differently in different contexts. So they are less spectacular, less visible from an international or wide point of view, but they are equally violent for communities experiencing them. This, again, in Israel has occurred rather differently than in the occupied 67 territories and has been mostly done through legal or administrative and political means. Of course, there are continuities between the establishment of the State of Israel and the British Mandate that before was in charge of supervising, that sort of like accompanying the process of independence. And indeed, most of the spatial regime that we have now is still drawing on the 1921 framework set by the British colonial power there. Of course, with the establishment of Israel in 1948, there was a translation of the legislation from that of an empire to that of a proper nation state, where everything started to be dissolved and recomposed throughout the language of bureaucracy and legislation. Something changed, particularly with the migration of several Jewish communities in the 60s and 75, and several of the laws for repatriation of Jewish communities, which is also a trend that is visible after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1989 and then officially in 1999. And what I try to do is basically to see how the continuities of these colonial frameworks are still somehow injected in different laws and in different administrative frameworks, particularly with the inauguration of the so-called neoliberal turn of capitalism, which again really diluted this violence through more legal means. Just to provide some practical examples, one of these is the inauguration of the so-called admission committees. So basically, most Israeli Jewish cities today have a group of 10 people basically deciding who can buy or who can live in particular neighborhoods on the very loose principles of not undermining the social cohesion and milieu, which is indeed very arbitrary. And again, considering the racial dimension of the state has been used to basically exclude Palestinian citizenship de facto of buying and renting in specific areas of the country. This situation has also got pretty much worse on the 2015 with the implementation of the so-called Humanities law, where basically all the buildings that have no permit have been demolished. Now, this can, might be something that, from a Western or London point of view, might even seems not, that crazy. So that's why I would like to go in the case of Palestine to show how this situation really plays with what we have on the ground. So just to contextualize it, since 1948, legally, we've seen how Israel has shrunk the municipal lines of Palestinian municipalities. So we have here, for instance, the case of Tamra, which in 1948 was defined by the red line, and then today basically it's squeezed into this blue outline. It goes without saying that, of course, over 5 decades, the Palestinian population has grown pretty much, and therefore this has created also a housing situation of overcrowding, meaning also that the community had to internally flee from one area of the town to the other, creating several issues particularly considering that before 1948, land was mostly held in common. So when the state was established, authorities were asking citizens to prove that they, that these lands were of their own, or that this house, would belong to them. But this was really not the custom, and this is really also one of the triggers of the situation as we see today, where basically people did not manage to see their rights recognized in the newly established forms of the Israeli state. So first thing, shrinking of municipal line. Second issue, not being able to, having their permit recognized within the framework of the state. But what I'm also interested, it's also to see how these processes continue through neoliberalism with the development of infrastructure, which, funny enough, is often portrayed as bringing and reproducing the trope of development or progress, also for the Palestinian communities there. But de facto has been used as a further way to dispossessing communities. So we see here, in the case of the same town there, how basically a gas line and also electricity grids, and also basically the route of a new road, 444, has been used to split the town in two. Now, you might see that the main issue here is that this road here goes from north to south, and it meant to actually bring Israeli communities from north to south, but there is really no entrance and no way, for Palestinians to actually benefit from this setup. Think, of course, what this means in terms of also collecting international funds in many cases to support these endeavors, as helping out Palestinians in their own towns and so on and so forth. But beyond that, and beyond, again, isolating and scattering Palestinian communities, which back in the days were all connected, and now they are basically not only enclave, but also their speciality is divided through the sovereign position of Israeli towns. We also see basically the division between agricultural land and the city of building up area. Now, again, this on paper might not really seem to be a big issue. I don't know if many of you are architects or engineers, but that might seem also the right way to do things to some extent, having all the infrastructure in line. However, again, considering the context in which these things happen, these are also meant that several Palestinian communities physically and spatially couldn't reach their agricultural land anymore throughout the years, and this meant that this land has been again confiscated by the state because it wasn't used, and now there is a plan for expansion of a new Israeli Jewish city to do that. So again, talking about other less visible or more invisible ways to do dispossession and extraction throughout the new tropes of the neoliberal planning, we see here, visually, I think, a good characterization about Palestinian cities like Kfar Kara here, Harara, or al-Qutuf, for instance, have been divided through, this very weird ring-shaped new Israeli city, which pretty much work as a settlement. So, I define this in my own research as a city settlement. Settlements, you might be aware, are only officially those in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, but because of the very working spatially, it seems pretty much, the very same dynamics, just done through different means. So we see, this is a plan, of expansion, which is meant to be in place in 10 years' time. And we see how, again, the Palestinian cities here will be separated. And on top of them, what we see overlap is the sovereign position of a mega city called Harish, which again will not just work spatially to divide Palestinian communities, but also, of course, attract a good concentration of wealth or political economy, which can definitely not compete with the smaller scale communities nearby. So just some of examples here to see how these things work in practice. Theoretically, my research could end here, and this could be a very visually appealing, a very sexual research to do, and that's why I want to discuss with you what might be some of the problematics about thinking about space in this way. So please, phone in hands, if you could scan this QR code